Good morning, everyone. My name is Terry Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, or NEWMOA, and I want to welcome you to our webinar this morning on the Aerosol Can Universal Waste Rule. Just before we begin the webinar, I just want to review some of the logistics to make sure everyone is sort of familiar with how this works. NEWMOA holds regular monthly, usually conference calls relating to RCRA issues that are of interest to our members in the Northeast states. And this month, because of the recently released rule, which EPA published in the Federal Register on December 9th, we decided to hold this webinar. And there are a number of folks on the webinar who are not from the Northeast region, so I want to welcome you to joining us this morning. We will keep the phone lines muted during the presentation so that there's no chance for audio distractions. If at the end of the presentation we have an opportunity for folks to, we might unmute some folks who have questions. We'll see how that works. During the webinar, if you have a question or you have a comment, if you look at your control panel, there's an area for questions. So please avail yourself of the question box, post your questions. I will monitor them. I think the presenters will be monitoring them as well, so that then we can have questions at the end. But we won't take questions during the presentation this morning. So or you can use the chat feature as well. If you're having any kind of electronic problem or problems with the GoToWebinar interface, we can try to help you. So just alert us through the chat feature if there's any issues with your GoToWebinar connection. So we will take questions at the very end of the presentation. We are recording this webinar. I just want folks to be aware of that, so be aware of that during your questions. And we are going to post the presentation after the call, after the webinar, excuse me, on the NEWMOA website, and I will let everyone know where they can find it at the time. We do value your feedback on the webinar, and you will receive automatically from GoToWebinar a survey. And so we would really appreciate your using the survey and giving us your feedback. Tracy, I think we can see your dashboard. So I'm not sure you want us to be looking at that. Just FYI. Tracy?
Got it.
Okay. So we have two presenters this morning from EPA Headquarters. It's great that they were willing and able to join us. We have Tracy Atagi, who is one of the leads from EPA Headquarters, who was involved in writing the Aerosol Can Universal Waste Rule. She has worked for EPA for 30 or so years, and she's worked on a number of RCRA rules, including the definition of solid waste. And so those of you who've been involved in NEWMOA webinars or at SWAMO activities, I'm sure you're familiar with Tracy. Also, Kathy Lett. She has worked for EPA Headquarters for almost 20 years. She also worked on the Generator Improvement Rule and the definition of solid waste rule, and was one of the leads on the Aerosol Can Universal Waste Rule. So it's a pleasure to have Tracy and Kathy this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to them. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Terry. So thank you for inviting us to give this webinar. As Terry said, I am the lead on the Aerosol Can Universal Waste Rule. Kathy is the lead on the Universal Waste Program in general. So Kathy will be starting off the presentation and going through some of the background information on aerosol cans and on universal waste. And then I'll be speaking to the specifics of the rule.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. This is Kathy Lett.
As you all know already, we are talking about the Aerosol Can Universal Waste Rule, which was published on December 9th, 2019. You can find it in the Federal Register and on our website. And with the exception of some conforming changes and a technical nature, basically what it does is it amends 40 CFR Part 273, which is the Universal Waste Program. So the rule has a 60-day effective date federally, which makes it effective on February 7th, 2020. And so at that point, it will be effective in non-authorized states, in Iowa and Alaska, in Indian country, in most U.S. territories. And of course, because it's universal waste, this is a less stringent part of the RCRA program, so it won't be effective in authorized states until the state adopts the new rule. And those states are not required to adopt the new rule. There are 6 states that already have aerosol cans as part of their universal waste. One kind of unique thing about the universal waste program is that states can go ahead and beat us to it, and they can add waste streams to their own state universal waste programs, even if they're not on the federal list. So 6 states have done that. They're listed on the slide: California, Colorado, Minnesota, New Mexico, Ohio, and Utah. So they already have this in a somewhat different format for some of them. We're going to do a brief background just on aerosol cans so that we all are on the same page about what we're looking at. So aerosol cans are typically hazardous waste for generators and when they're discarded. And they're typically hazardous because of the propellants, which are ignitable, and then some of the cans would also contain actual contents, the thing that's getting sprayed out of the can, that could be hazardous waste. So in some cases, the high levels of aerosol cans generated by an establishment can mean that an otherwise not generating establishment can be brought into RCRA. Universal waste aerosol cans is also another area which is somewhere where the generators are familiar with a lot of the ways that you safely manage aerosol cans. The cans, when they're products, are subject to OSHA and DOT requirements for safe management, and those requirements address flammability. And so they are, like I said, accustomed to how you manage these cans safely as products, which is going to be similar to how they need to be managed safely as waste. The main health concern for aerosol cans at the end of life is when the potential for releases and fires do increase at that point. And that's what we're addressing in the aerosol can regulations under universal waste. So the main goals of adding aerosol cans to the program would be some of the main goals of the program as a whole. So that would be easing the burdens on retail stores and other generators who have this as a major waste stream, but are already managing them, well within the scope of what universal waste requires. Also promoting the collection and the recycling of the cans. And finally, encouraging the development of programs at the city, municipal level or in commercial programs that would reduce the quantity of these that are going to landfills or combustors and instead getting them to recycling. The rule is a part of EPA's 2016 retail strategy. We had a NOTA in 2014 which identified aerosol cans as a particular issue for retailers, among some other things. And this strategy that EPA put together in 2016, it also included parts of the things that were done in the 2016 generator final rule and the 2019 pharmaceuticals rule. And the aerosol can universal waste rule does mark the final component of the retail strategy. So we have completed what we spoke about in 2016 for how we were going to address hazardous waste in the retail sector as a different kind of area where hazardous waste is generated. Okay, so I know we have a bunch of different folks on the line today. You may already know something about universal waste, but we're going to go through it real quickly. So we have a quick refresher. The two keys for the universal waste program are that the regulations streamline hazardous waste management standards for the categories of hazardous waste that are included in universal waste. So those would be waste that are commonly generated by a wide variety of establishments, and also that the universal waste present a relatively low risk during accumulation and transport compared to other hazardous waste. So the four previously existing types of federal hazardous waste are batteries, pesticides handled under a recall or part of a special program, mercury-containing equipment, and mercury lamps. So this will add to that list of four. We'll make it 5. Like I mentioned, some states already have other materials on their state universal waste lists. Within the universal waste program, we use a slightly different vocabulary than under the Part 262 generator requirements. The participants, for the most part, are handlers, and they are split into a small and a large quantity handler categories depending on how much universal waste they have at one time, and destination facilities. Handlers, this is not a comprehensive list of requirements, but just to give an idea, handlers can accumulate universal waste for a year. They're not required to use a manifest. They may ship universal waste to and from other handlers. There is a labeling requirement. There are, several options written within the regs to show what would be appropriate labeling, depending on the waste stream. In this case, universal waste aerosol cans. There is a training requirement, and then tracking the universal waste, and that's for large quantity handlers, in addition to export requirements. In general, the large quantity handlers do have somewhat more stringent provisions than the small quantity handlers. In the regs, the two sets of requirements are split up, with the small quantity handlers in 273.13 and the large quantity handlers in 273.33. The requirements do parallel each other, but the large quantity handlers have somewhat more stringent in some of the areas about what they need to do. Destination facilities are, as it says on the slide, subject to all applicable requirements in 264, 5, 6, 268, and 270. Basically, they're TSDFs, or hazardous waste recyclers. The hazardous waste that are universal waste, they end up going to the same facilities that they would end up going to under 262. The real streamlining of the regs happens for the generators. And then I mentioned the state programs that already exist. For those 6 states that already allow universal waste for aerosol cans, all those states allow handlers to puncture and drain aerosol cans under their programs. California does have an additional prohibition against puncturing and draining at commercial processors. But we do have some information about what these states are already requiring, I think, in the docket to the rulemaking. Now, for what you've really come for is the juiciness of the new rule, and Tracy's going to cover that.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for that introduction. I'll try to make this as exciting as possible. So, specifically for aerosol cans, most of the requirements are the same as any other kind of universal waste that Kathy just went over. 1 year for accumulation, proper packaging and labeling.
Universal waste aerosol can is one example in the regs. A couple other alternatives include waste aerosol cans or used aerosol cans. Employee training, which is more stringent for the larger quantity handlers. ID number and tracking for those large quantity handlers, and export requirements that are the same as for hazardous waste or other hazardous wastes. A couple of things that are unique to aerosol cans, or at least is specific to aerosol cans, is if for aerosol cans that show evidence of leaking or damage, they have to be managed separately. They in a closed container that is overpacked with absorbents, or as an alternative, immediately punctured and drained following the requirements, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is consistent with other types of leaking universal waste, such as batteries, and is also consistent with what Colorado and Ohio, for example, have done with their universal waste programs. As far as what exactly is a aerosol can for the purposes of the universal waste rule, we did echo some of the elements from the DOT's definition to try and have consistency on the federal level as a non-refillable receptacle, basically which gas compressed liquefied, which is used to expel a product. So things that contain only gas when that gas is expelled as a product would fit under the universal waste, or cans that are that dispense products like shaving gel, but it's still basically that non-refillable self-closing container. Containers that would not be aerosol cans would be like compressed gas containers or propane cylinders, where basically they're storage for the gas, but they're not intended to dispense a product. Another unique issue we had to deal with aerosol cans that Kathy touched on was puncturing and draining. Now, under existing hazardous waste regulations, federal interpretation has been that the puncturing and draining of an aerosol can is part of the recycling process and therefore is exempt from permitting requirements. But the interesting thing about universal waste regulations is that handlers are not allowed to even recycle universal waste unless there's specific provisions in the regulations for that. Universal waste recycling has to be at a destination facility. But since the 6 states that have been implementing the aerosol cans as universal waste allow for puncturing and draining, and have been doing that safely in the case of Colorado and California for more than a decade, we did feel and asked for comment on a number of issues regarding puncturing and draining, and did include final requirements that allows for puncturing and draining at the handlers, with requirements that we put in place to be protective of human health and the environment. So those final puncturing and draining requirements include having a written procedure detailing how to safely puncture and drain the cans, maintaining that procedure on site, and also following that procedure. The regs do specify that you do have to follow the procedure as well as have it. It also requires that the manufacturer's instructions be kept on site as well. So training on the proper procedures for the employees. The puncturing and draining must be done in a manner designed to prevent releases to the environment and prevent fires. And then any contents from the can must immediately go into a container and undergo a hazardous waste determination. And if they are hazardous waste, then of course all the generator requirements kick in at that point. So the contents of an aerosol cans are not universal waste, and then if they're hazardous, they have to be managed as hazardous waste, and the facility that punctures and drains them is the generator for that. In addition, there's a requirement for a spill kit to be provided, and that any spills or leaks be cleaned up properly and promptly. So that's basically it. It's pretty straightforward rule, except for with the issue of puncturing and draining. So I think with that, we have our contact information for further questions, or we can answer
we have
questions.
plenty of time to take them now if you have them.
I don't see any questions in the question box, so I would urge folks to post questions at this point, if you have any.
It is a fairly straightforward rule.
So someone, oh, okay, there's a question about reactivity. I'm going to try to unmute the person who's raising that question, and that's Ross Bunnell from Connecticut. Ross, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead.
Hi, Terry. My machine's telling me I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ross. Oh, but we got a echo. Russ?
In Connecticut's comments on the rule, we suggested that EPA establish policy regarding the reactivity characteristic. I understand that by designating aerosol cans as universal waste, it in large part moots out the reactivity characteristic issue, but it is still important for a couple of reasons, I think. One is that there are certain aerosol cans that might not be hazardous potentially for anything other than reactivity. So it raises a question about, that admittedly small universe of aerosol cans and, whether EPA's existing guidance on reactivity is still in place, which is basically we're not in a position to determine whether or not an aerosol can is reactive. The generator is authorized states to do that. The other scenario is just, if aerosol cans, let's say, aren't being punctured and drained, let's say they're going to incineration. It raises the issue of facility permitting requirements. One of the issues we found with respect to the reactivity characteristic is that some of the generators in Connecticut have been told by their TSDFs not to put the D003 code on aerosol cans that are being shipped as fully regulated hazardous waste, because then the facility can't receive it. A lot of facilities are restricted from taking reactive hazardous waste or certain types of reactive hazardous waste unless they're handled in a very special manner. So it can have the effect of either preventing some TSDFs from taking aerosol cans or make it more expensive to do so. So I think for those two reasons, the reactivity issue is still an issue. And I was wondering if EPA had any comment on where they stand on the reactivity characteristic with respect to aerosol cans, A, and B, if they have any advice for states if they are maintaining their current position of we can't say conclusively whether or not aerosol cans are reactive. It's up to generators and authorized states to do that. And then I realize it's a complicated question, so if I need to rephrase any part of it, let me know.
No, Ross, I understand your question and I appreciate it. We do appreciate all the folks, and we did get many comments on asking for clarification on the reactivity characteristic. We did determine it was outside the scope of making a general reactivity determination for aerosol cans under the universal waste rule, but we will be considering all those comments as we look at whether we can do some further clarification. I know this has been a long-standing issue, and we have done some work internally on seeing if we can do something like that. And I understand I can help use the feedback we get in these webinars to kind of encourage that work to continue. But in the meantime, the existing guidance as far as there's no conclusive statement we can make on all the reactivity of all aerosol cans, and it's basically up to the specific can, the determination on the specific cans. One thing with
products cans is they do have labels, so that does help a little bit as far as determining what their contents are in general.
Ross, do you have anything to follow up?
Yes, I do, and I think I'd encourage other states to chime in if they feel compelled to do so. From Connecticut's standpoint, I concede that it's a difficult issue, and we've grappled with it because you can have situations where you can have a whole variety of situations. You can have a situation where the propellant may be a flammable or explosive material, and you can have a situation where contents can, in a sudden pressure release scenario, release a vapor or a mist that can be explosive, very similar to what's called in the emergency response community of levy, boiling liquid evaporating vapor explosion. As you may recall, in Connecticut's response to comments on the NOTA for the retail sector, we submitted a photograph of the results of the explosion of a single can of hairspray at a hotel near one of the casinos in Connecticut. That was pretty striking. The aerosol can had been placed near a candle that was up burning, and it exploded, and it did quite a bit of damage to the hotel room, including blowing a 4x6 window completely out of the building. Not just the window, but the window frame. So, you know, our kind of technical take on this is, you know, on one end of the spectrum, if you have, and it sounds crazy, but something like hairspray, especially, it has a lot of alcohol in it. And, you know, if there is a propellant that's used, such as propane isobutane, which is still commonly used in a lot of aerosol products, then you have a situation where if that can releases suddenly under heated conditions, and there's a source of ignition present, it's going to cause a major, I think the correct term in the fire investigation world is a deflagration, which is a especially rapid kind of explosion, but not a detonate, which is faster than the speed of sound. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you had, let's say, a water-based window cleaner with a carbon dioxide propellant, I mean, if that's heated under confinement, the carbon dioxide is going to expand to the point where the can will fail, and it will go pop, but it won't go boom necessarily. And you have probably every possible combination in between. So I don't think, you know, our feeling is I don't think that every aerosol can needs to be classified as a reactive hazardous waste, but I think we feel that some of them definitely should be because they have the capability to cause quite a significant explosion. And if you think about one can of hairspray did and scale that up to a full drum or a fire situation at a TSDF, and you could have a real serious situation. At the same time, we recognize the difficulties all of that can cause with respect to TSDFs. However, I think a lot of that would be ameliorated by the universal waste designation, so that wouldn't become a problem until the final destination facility, or it would be rendered moot if the cans were drained and drained. So that's kind of our feeling on this. And I'm not sure we could suggest any criteria more objective than that, but there might be something we can hang our hats on from a DOT perspective or from a product safety perspective. I don't know, but it would be nice to have a clear, bright line for when the reactivity characteristic applies to aerosol cans and when it doesn't.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Ross. A couple of things to keep in mind is that it's true that aerosol cans can be hazardous as products, and
RCRA isn't going to help with aerosol cans in hotel rooms and so forth. One of the things we do point to in the preamble is the fact that there are existing regulations on OSHA, and there's fire codes as far as storage of aerosol cans. All of those would continue to apply. The main thing that the rule does is help with collection of the aerosol cans and getting them to a hazardous waste facility, or getting them punctured and drained under environmentally appropriate ways. So, just talking about the universal waste rule and not the reactivity designation, we do think that the rule itself kind of helps. It both relies on the safeguards that are there for aerosol products, which would also apply in the case of the other aerosol cans, and will help actually divert the aerosol cans out of the municipal waste stream and get them to hazardous waste, so kind of cut down on the potential at MRFs or other places where aerosol cans might cause a problem.
And Ross, again here, I just wanted to clarify one thing. The reason I brought up the hotel situation was not because we're thinking of writing hazardous waste regulations to regulate hairspray in hotels. It's just that scenario exemplifies just how, under the right conditions, I stress that, just how hazardous even a single aerosol can be. And I'll also point out that when aerosol cans are coming from the manufacturer out to retail or facilities or users, they're packaged in a certain way. They've got the cap on. They've got the nozzle firmly in place. They're brand new. There's no rust. When we get onto the opposite end of the life cycle of an aerosol can, all those things aren't necessarily in place. You don't necessarily have a sound container or a container that's as structurally sound as it once was. You may have a leaking nozzle. You may have no cap on the top of the can to protect the movement of the nozzle and the release of the contents and things like that. So I think waste aerosol cans do present certain hazards that new aerosol cans don't, and OSHA rules and DOT rules and such are primarily patterned after unused aerosol cans.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and that's part of the reason we included the requirements for the damaged or leaking aerosol cans to be handled separately. Again, getting them out of the municipal waste stream and to a TSDF.
Understood. I just wanted to say one more thing before I hope some of the other states will chime in on the reactivity issue or other issues. We've noted, and I'd be interested in hearing from other states on this, because we try to encourage people to recycle aerosol cans, and we have a policy by which people can puncture and drain aerosol cans without a permit, provided they have a device that's capable of capturing liquids and any gases that may vent from those liquids, and that's usually done with drum top mounted aerosol can crushing devices that have a granular activated carbon filter on the plugged into the screwed into the small bung on the opposite end of the drum top. But we found that what we've heard from generators is a couple of things on the recycling front. One, it's very difficult for them to get their aerosol cans to a recycling facility, particularly a scrap metal recycling facility, unless they have been punctured and drained. And I think that's for obvious reasons. The scrap metal facilities aren't really equipped to handle them, and even if the generator claims that they're empty, there's likely to be situations where a non-empty one slips in there. And then the other thing is that some generators tell us that they want to recycle their aerosol cans, they want to cut down on their generation of hazardous waste, but they find the aerosol can puncturing devices to be quite expensive. If you're generating a few dozen aerosol cans a month, as many do, they don't seem to blink at spending a few hundred or $1,000 or over $1,000 on equipment to puncture aerosol cans. But if you're a small business generating, maybe a couple of dozen cans a year, or even more than that, they might be very reluctant to purchase the equipment, and that can make it hard to recycle.
Absolutely, and that's exactly why we did the universal waste rule, because under the rule, then the generators, they don't have to count it towards their generator status. They can send it to a TSDF without having a manifest. They can accumulate up to a year. So I think, one of the things we're hoping to see is an increase in the recycling of aerosol cans, because it gives the handlers more options, so they don't have to. That is a question I've gotten a couple of times, whether handlers have to puncture and drain, and absolutely not. If they want to just send the intact cans to TSDF, that's fine.
Or I guess if I interpreted it correctly, these small generators could send their small amounts of aerosol cans to another handler. I'm just throwing this out as an idea. Say if they buy their aerosol cans from a industrial supply company, and that industrial supply company takes them back like they do fluorescent lamps, then the industrial supply company could puncture and drain the aerosol cans under this rule, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Tracy,
thanks,
did you
Terry.
say
That's all
yes?
I have.
Did you say yes? There's some audio issues, but go ahead, Tracy. Did you say yes?
I said yes.
Okay. Thank you. All right, I'm going to mute you, Ross, and then I'm going to go on to the next questions. So the next question is from Brian. I hope I pronounced this right, Veet. He asks, and I'm going to unmute him in a second, are inhalers included in the definition? I assume by that he means definition of an aerosol can. It seems like it is, but we would like to get your opinion.
Yeah, inhalers would typically meet the definition of aerosol can for the purposes of universal waste.
Brian, I've unmuted you. Do you want? Oh no, no, you're not unmuted. Do you have any follow-up questions?
I guess it would kind of depend on what the propellant is for the inhaler and what is in the inhaler, kind of, as I read the rule a little bit more thoroughly.
About whether it's a
If it would be, yeah, I mean, I don't think most of them probably are not hazardous wastes. I don't really know the makeup of an inhaler, but I think they'd probably use CO2 as a propellant, if anything, because you're breathing the stuff. So doing anything that has any flammability characteristics as a propellant might be an issue if it came in contact with the medicine. But I don't know too much about them. We discussed it internally, and it came up as a question. And I just thought I'd ask what your opinion was on inhalers being potentially hazardous waste and a universal waste at that point now.
Yeah, aerosol cans aren't necessarily all hazardous either. So it would only be the hazardous waste inhalers or the hazardous waste aerosol cans that would fall under the requirements as having to follow those or the hazardous waste requirements. Now, it doesn't stop people from just going ahead and managing all their aerosol cans as universal waste. They don't, most of the time it's easier if they just go ahead and manage them all the same way. Easier for them, I mean. And there's nothing in the rule that prevents folks from just kind of complying with universal waste rules, even if the aerosol can or the inhaler in this case is not hazardous.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Brian, I'm going to mute you, and we're going to go on to the next question. It's from Martin Sanchez, who's also from New Jersey. He has two questions. Can you go over the definition of an empty aerosol can? And then his second question is, can a handler only puncture their own aerosol cans? And I'll unmute Martin.
All right. Well, I mean,
Oh, I'm going to mute Martin.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
As far as when an aerosol can is empty, it would have to meet the empty container requirements in 261.7. So, you know, in general, it would have to be at atmospheric pressure for the volatiles and emptied of the contents. If it happened to have contained P-listed waste, which we weren't aware of any, but it's theoretically possible, then it would have to be triple rinsed. But if it contains no significant liquids, it could be recycled as scrap metal. So that's another option for cans that have had all the liquids removed. So hopefully that answers your first question. And then the second question, is it only the first handler that can puncture and drain? No, the second handler can, you know, collect from a number of different handlers and puncture and drain and recycle the cans under the rule. They would have to follow the puncturing and draining procedures that are in the rule.
Okay, I'm going to try to unmute Martin and see if it'll be bad again, but Martin, did you have anything to follow up on?
No, we're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Okay, I'm going to move
I think
on.
for the folks that are talking, it's important to mute your computer. I guess if you're talking through your computer, it might be hard. Never mind.
Well,
if you're on the phone and the computer.
Yeah, yes, that's what causes a lot of the audio problems, is the sort of crossing of the computer microphone and your phone. So the next question is from Giles Steele Perkins. He's with Massachusetts DEP. And a second, I'll unmute him. But his question is, does collecting the contents mean collecting the aerosol gases too? Do the states with this universal waste rule require collection of these constituents? Otherwise, it would be disposal to the atmosphere? He poses that as a question.
Yeah, the requirements do specify that it has to be designed to prevent releases, but typically the gases aren't collected, although in some cases they are in some of the larger commercial aerosol can puncturing and draining. But there would need to be some sort of carbon filter or something that addresses the air releases.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Giles. Giles, did you have any follow-up on that? Giles, you're unmuted. I guess not. Okay. The next question is from Kathleen Foley, and Kathleen is with EPA. She says, please restate the question. Couldn't hear the person speaking. I'm not sure which question she's referring to. Please summarize the speaker's point of concern. It is difficult to hear on a webinar when not using the main microphone. So that's just some advice on you know, I guess repeating the question. So the next question comes from Jim Sullivan. He says, curious, any Clean Air Act implications at puncture stations? The puncturing is usually a small source, e.g. 5-gallon drum with carbon filter. Just thinking about what disaster bulb crushers were. I don't know if you guys have any comments on that.
No, I mean, we didn't affect, the question was what were the Clean Air Act implications for the puncturing and draining. It's unchanged, so whatever Clean Air Act would apply to puncturing and draining at the generators now are the same for the handlers under the rule.
Okay. I'm going to unmute Jim. Did you have any follow-up, Jim?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay, I think you said no, thank you. Okay. Our next question is from Eric, it might be Wace, Nebraska. He's from Nebraska. Apparently he has no microphone. If it holds pressure, is it reactive by our, if it holds pressure, it is reactive by our interpretation. I assume he means Nebraska's. If the propellant is also flammable, ignitable, it would have a second waste code. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, again, as I mentioned when we were talking to Ross, we did not change the current requirements for reactivity for aerosol cans. You know, and of course, states can always be more stringent, so we wouldn't have affected Nebraska's rules in any case.
Okay, I don't, Eric says he has no microphone, so I don't think I can unmute him. So hopefully that's what he's looking for. Okay, another question from Ross. How about pepper spray containers? Are they aerosol cans? Some of them have a liquid content that's flammable and a gas propellant. We've gotten calls from police departments that generate a lot of these. They expire after a while.
Yes, pepper sprays would fall into the aerosol can definition, or at least typically, yeah.
Okay. And then Ross is asking, also, what about cans that contain only a gas, such as compressed air, actually a compressed CFC or HCFC compound in many cases, or air horns? Are they aerosol cans if they don't have any liquid component?
Yeah, as long as it's dispensing something deliberately as a product, then yes, it would fall under the aerosol cans. If it's a self-closing valve, it's the cases where it's not an aerosol can is if it's like a gas canister where you have to hook it up to something and then release the valve to move it. But in general, aerosol cans is a pretty broad term.
And what about cans that contain compressed air? The same thing?
Same thing.
Okay. Ross, I'm going to unmute you. Anything else you want to do to follow up on that? Oh, I don't seem to be able to. You're self-muted. So if you want to add anything.
No, that answers it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, that's great. Another thing from Eric in Nebraska. Nebraska's interpretation is a bit unique. We consider the can itself to be hazardous for reactivity. Any comments on that?
I mean, again, we're not changing current interpretations, and states can always be more stringent. So we are not affecting Nebraska's interpretation.
Okay.
Which I agree is rather unique.
Okay, those are all the questions from the question box. I'll leave it open for another few minutes to see if anyone else has any other final questions. I don't know, Tracy or Kathy, if you have any final thoughts you want to share?
We just let folks know we are working on developing some FAQs, so this has been very helpful to hear folks' questions. And our contact information is on the screen, of course, and so please feel free to follow up if anything comes at a later point as far as questions about the rule.
So when do you think you'll have the FAQs available?
Kind of depends on other things going on. We're a bit pressed right now, but if we get a lot of confusion, or we might do it quicker. But otherwise, I would say probably in a month or two.
Okay, thank you. So I don't see any other questions. So if that's the case, then we can wrap things up this morning. Again, I want to thank Kathy and Tracy for joining us, and I want to let folks know that we will be posting both questions and this recording. Actually, now there are 2 questions that have been posted. So here's a question from Kevin Kajanka. Are there regulations on collecting liquids from puncturing? For example, should only one type of product be placed in the bin? And I assume what he means by product is the contents of the can.
Yeah, I mean, the contents have to be compatible as far as, it would basically the generator rules that would apply.
The same regulations that would apply to any newly generated waste. So putting incompatible materials in the same container is not allowed. They have to make hazardous waste determination. If they determine that it is hazardous waste, they've got, generators categories and subpart I and J requirements for, subpart I, I guess, for containers. Anything that would otherwise apply to a generator of hazardous waste would apply to anyone draining aerosol cans. We would expect that people who endeavor to do that
know what they're getting into as far as the hazardous waste implications in Part 262.
Okay, thank you. I can't unmute Kevin because he hasn't put in his audio code, but he's from EPA. So Ross also posted a new message, which is that he'd like to hear from other states on the reactivity characteristics. So stay tuned. Maybe we can have some follow-up conversations about that. Tammy Caligandes from New Hampshire asks, if a handler is a puncturer, do they have to meet the preparedness and prevention and incompatibility requirements? And I'll try to unmute Tammy. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Terry, this is John.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, Terry?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is John. The question basically, does the universal waste requirements end at the puncturer where all RCRA generator requirements then take over? I think Tracy answered that, but the subject for hazardous waste determination. I just want to be clear, if they had a fire explosion or incompatibility issue, it would also apply, the preparedness and prevention and incompatibility generator requirements for that accident.
Yeah, basically all the generator requirements would kick in. So if they're a large quantity generator of the contents of hazardous contents from the cans, then all the contingency planning and so forth would apply. And the contents are considered generated when they exit the cans, because that's the end of the recycling process for the cans. So it does apply when it goes into, if it's the kind of puncturing and draining system where it goes into a receiving a drum that's only meant to accumulate the waste, then that's the point that RCRA kicks in.
Okay. How is that clear in the rules? And the preamble, or is it stated in the applicability, or?
The point of generation question?
Right.
I mean, the 262 is actually in the regs, applicability for the contents of the cans after a hazardous waste determination. But I know it's at least in the response to comments, the point of generation question. But that might be definitely a good one for the FAQ.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else, John, or anyone from New Hampshire want to ask? Okay. One more comment from Ross. In other words, do they, I think he means EPA headquarters, consider aerosol cans to be reactive, and if so, what criteria do they use? I'll unmute you again, Ross, and see if you want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah.
So Ross, okay, go ahead.
My attempt to clarify my earlier question that I'm interested in hearing from other states on the reactivity issue. So what I meant by that is, do they consider aerosol cans to be reactive, and if so, what criteria do they use to determine whether or not they are reactive?
Okay.
That wasn't a question for EPA.
Okay, all right, sorry. Oh, I misunderstood that. Okay.
Terry, on the previous question, someone asked if we discussed it in the preamble. There is a quick mention on page 67214 at the bottom of the first column, where we talk about the material going, after it's been drained, having to make a hazardous waste determination at that point under 262.11 and getting into the regular Part 262 system. And then the reg language, if we want to be complete about it, is in 273.33A for Roman numeral 5, and then there'd be a corresponding one for the small quantity handlers.
Okay, Ross, I don't think we can, we have 80 people on the phone, so I'm not eager to unmute everyone to sort of hear from the other states. So I think that what we need to do is maybe take this up in another conversation with the states, maybe the NEWMOA Hazardous Waste Steering Committee or some other discussion, to hear from other states. The other possibilities for the NEWMOA states is to send out an email request for folks to provide their perspective on this question about aerosol cans and reactivity. Does that make sense, Ross? I think
Yes.
I unmuted you. Okay.
Oh, okay, am I unmuted? Yeah.
You're unmuted, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that would make perfect. I would suggest that all the states send in the response to that question. You know, where do you stand on reactivity? Do you consider aerosol cans reactive? And if so, what criteria you use? Just send an email to Terry, and Terry can patch them together and send them back out to all the NEWMOA states.
Okay. So we do have a comment from Eric, who I think is, again, from Nebraska. He says, the can itself is considered to be reactive if it can hold pressure. If punctured or open to the atmospheric pressure, it loses that designation. We consider a can popper, and that's in quotes, to be an allowable alteration of the cans to ease disposal/recycling. The fluids in the can must be captured and tested before disposal. Obviously, the can popper should be operated in a well-ventilated area if it does not have significant capture capability. Sorry.
Yeah, and again, just for folks to avoid confusion, that's Nebraska's current interpretation. It sounds like the popping requirements are similar to what we require under puncturing and draining, though.
Okay. Thanks. So I think that's all the questions and comments that we've received. And let me just double check the chat. No, there's nothing there. So again, I just want to thank you guys and appreciate your willingness to do this today, and urge people to follow up with you if there's any more questions or issues people want to raise. And have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, Terry.
Great. Okay. Bye-bye.